August 2011. 6 armored Mercedes-Benz sedans cross the Algerian border. Inside, the most powerful women of Libya flee a country in flames. One is 9 months pregnant. Another has just buried her husband and 2 children after an airstrike. Their patriarch still hides in the desert. Within weeks, he will be dead. The world watched the collapse of a dynasty built on blood and oil. But the foundation of this house was laid 43 years earlier. It did not begin with palaces or female bodyguards. It began with a schoolteacher named Fatia al-Nouri. Educated, proper, respectable. The marriage was an arrangement. The year was 1968. This was the traditional Libya. Gaddafi was a young officer, not yet a dictator. He later admitted they never met until the wedding night. On September 1, 1969, Gaddafi seized power in a coup. The old world died. The marriage died with it. The union lasted only 6 months. Fatia al-Nouri vanished. No photographs remain in circulation. No interviews exist in the archives. She became a footnote, scrubbed from the revolutionary narrative. By 2011, the world had forgotten her name. Fatia returned to total obscurity. As the first wife vanished into obscurity, a new center of power took shape in a military hospital ward in 1969. A young officer named Muammar Gaddafi lay in a bed with appendicitis. His nurse was Safia Farkash. She belonged to the Obeydat, a powerful tribe from eastern Libya. Some records place her birth in Beta. Others claim she was born in Mostar to Hungarian parents during the Austro-Hungarian era. The mystery of her origin remains. Gaddafi's choice did not. He called it love at first sight. The reality was a strategic merger. A military uniform sat beside a nurse's white habit. By 1970, they were married. This was no fleeting romance. Safia would remain his wife for 41 years. She gave him 7 biological children. She helped raise 2 more. But Safia was more than a mother. She became the power behind the throne. She navigated the lethal currents of Libyan politics and managed a sprawling household. Unlike her predecessor, Safia embraced the light. She attended state functions and traveled the world. She leveraged her tribal status to begin the systematic accumulation of wealth. Safia converted her political influence into a mechanism for wealth. She did not build a business. She created a tax on faith. How did a nurse become the owner of a national monopoly? The airline Burak Air provided the answer. The company controlled the exclusive rights to transport Libyan pilgrims to Mecca. Every year, thousands of citizens prepared for the Hajj. It was a religious obligation. For Safia, it was a revenue stream. A pilgrim paid several $1,000s for a ticket. The turbines of a Burak Air jet roared on the Tripoli runway. The plane took off for Saudi Arabia. The profit bypassed the state treasury and landed directly in the family's private accounts. Safia maintained an absolute monopoly on tens of thousands of pilgrims. She managed this empire from behind the walls of Bab al-Azizia. The compound was a fortified military base in southern Tripoli. It served as both a residence and a fortress. Concrete walls and armed guards insulated the family from Libyan poverty. Inside, the grounds featured sprawling gardens and swimming pools. The infrastructure rivaled military installations. Underground bunkers were engineered to withstand heavy airstrikes. Hundreds of employees maintained the estate. Cooks, gardeners, and drivers moved through the complex with quiet precision. Safia oversaw the logistics of this private world with cold efficiency. She ensured her 7 biological children lived in total luxury while the nation's infrastructure crumbled. Her independent wealth eventually exceeded even the documented resources of her husband. She operated in the shadows, avoiding interviews and political manifestos. She preferred the silence of the compound and the steady flow of cash from the aviation sector. Every Libyan pilgrim traveling to Mecca was legally required to use her airline. Assets became a stolen national resource. Monopoly profits from the Hajj pilgrims did not build schools. They flowed into Swiss bank accounts and European real estate. Safia Gaddafi owned luxury apartments in London. She held title deeds in Paris and Dubai. Her collection included high-end jewelry, rare artwork, and fleets of luxury vehicles. Estimates placed her wealth in the hundreds of millions of dollars. She was one of the richest women in Africa. She never held a single government post. The gap between the palace and the street was physical. Sophia traveled in armored convoys. During her foreign trips, luxury boutiques in Europe lowered their shutters. Staff cleared the floors before her arrival. She shopped in total isolation, while ordinary Libyans waited in lines for basic goods. In February 2011, the buffer dissolved. Decades of poverty met decades of excess. Protests erupted across the region. The Arab Spring reached the streets of Benghazi. Hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts provided no shield against the kinetic energy of a Hellfire missile. In April 2011, the mathematical certainty of NATO's air campaign replaced the abstract threat of the Arab Spring. Could concrete walls save a dynasty from a precision strike? 2 direct hits proved they could not. On April 30th, the neighborhood of Gargaresh shook. NATO aircraft targeted a private residence. Inside was Saif al-Arab, Sophia's 29-year-old son. He died instantly. 3 of Sophia's grandchildren died in the same blast. The youngest victims were toddlers. NATO officials cited military infrastructure as the objective. The sirens in Tripoli did not stop until dawn. The demolition of the family's safety continued 3 months later. On July 26th, the target moved to the inner circle. Another strike hit the Gaddafi compound. This mission eliminated Ahmed al-Gaddafi al-Qasi. He was a military colonel, a cousin, and the husband of Safia's daughter, Aisha. The blast killed Ahmed and another grandchild. Aisha survived while pregnant with her 4th child. The air was thick with the smell of pulverized concrete and cordite. The Bab al-Azizia fortress, once an impenetrable symbol of 40 years of power, turned into a tomb of scorched rebar. By August, rebel forces reached the outskirts of the capital. The logistics of survival outweighed the optics of the revolution. Safia abandoned the ruins and coordinated the family's flight from Tripoli. Muhammad represented the shadow wing of the dynasty. While his half-brothers craved military hardware and public adoration, the eldest son built a different kind of power. He controlled the Libyan Olympic Committee. He managed the national telecommunications monopoly. It was a technocratic empire hidden behind a facade of sports and cellular networks. The revolution dismantled this digital fortress in hours. Rebel forces stormed the family compound in Tripoli and placed Muhammad under house arrest. Did he negotiate with his captors? Some reports suggest a brief dialogue with rebel leaders, but the diplomacy was short-lived. Loyalists launched a rescue operation, extracting Muhammad from detention under the cover of chaos. He moved west. The destination was the Algerian border. On August 29, 2011, a convoy of armored Mercedes-Benz sedans reached the frontier. Muhammad traveled alongside Sophia and his half-siblings. The Algerian government granted entry on humanitarian grounds. It was a diplomatic gamble that Algiers would soon regret. For Fatiha, Muhammad's mother, the collapse was absolute. She had lived in the shadows since her divorce in 1970. Now, her only son was a fugitive. Unlike Safia Farkash, Fatiha issued no pleas to the United Nations. She remained silent. The transition from mogul to exile ended in the Middle East. Muhammad eventually settled in Oman. The Sultanate granted him political asylum on one condition: total silence. He has no social media. He grants no interviews. He exists only as a name on periodic UN sanction reports. Muhammad Gaddafi remains a permanent political refugee in Oman. Muhammad followed Sophia's convoy as it reached the outskirts of Tripoli. Before dawn on August 29, 2011, the final departure began. Black armored Mercedes sedans lined up in the dark. Dust from the Saharan highway settled on the reinforced glass. The engines stayed running. The logistics of the escape required crossing hundreds of kilometers of war zone. Pro-Gaddafi forces no longer controlled the roads. The family moved toward Ghadames, a remote desert outpost in the southwest. Hannibal and Muhammad monitored the perimeter. Sophia focused on the passengers. How does a falling regime force a border open? Through a biological emergency. Aisha Gaddafi was in active labor. This was the decisive factor. As the convoy reached the Algerian border, the family presented a humanitarian ultimatum. A woman in labor, a child about to be born in the sand. The border guards faced a diplomatic nightmare. The Algerian government initially denied any crossing. They claimed the border was secure. Then the evidence surfaced. Faced with the reality of the convoy, Algiers pivoted. They admitted the Gaddafis had entered the country. The National Transitional Council in Tripoli reacted with fury. They labeled the move an act of aggression. They demanded immediate extradition to face Libyan justice. Algeria ignored the ultimatum. They cited the strictly humanitarian necessity of Aisha's condition. The transition was complete. The Gaddafis were no longer rulers of the Jamahiriya, but international fugitives. The Algerian authorities refused to hand over the family to the rebels. The villa in Staweli stood as a silent perimeter of stone and soldiers. High walls, armed guards. For the Algerian government, this was a matter of state security. For the Gaddafi family, it was a gilded cage. Instead of the sprawling barracks of Bab al-Azizia, their world shrunk to a few guarded rooms in a suburb of Algiers. How much does a dictator's safety cost in exile? Total isolation and the freezing of every cent. The transition from rulers to prisoners was absolute. Behind the gates, Muhammad and Hannibal discovered a new reality. They were powerless. Their names no longer opened doors. Their commands ended at the villa's threshold. Outside, the National Transitional Council demanded their heads. Inside, the Algerian authorities cut the lines. No internet, no unmonitored calls. The state feared a single inflammatory statement could ignite the remaining loyalists in Libya. On August 30th, the silence was broken by the cry of a newborn. Aisha gave birth to a daughter in the desert city of Janet. She named the child Sophia Janet. It was a tribute to a grandmother and a birthplace, recorded in the shadow of a revolution. The sound of the infant's crying echoed through a house filled with mourning for the dead and the disappeared. The family's financial backbone had snapped. On paper, Sophia controlled a fortune of tens of millions. In reality, the figure was zero. International sanctions had locked every account. They possessed vast wealth they could not touch. They were billionaires living on the charity of a host that found their presence increasingly toxic. Sophia moved through the villa as a widow, though the world had not yet told her. Her husband was still breathing, trapped in the ruins of Sirte. She waited for a signal that would never come. Communication was a dead end. The isolation remained unbroken until the morning of October 20th. The reports from Sirte on October 20th, 2011, ended any remaining hope on the Algerian villa. Muammar Gaddafi was dead. Rebel fighters captured the colonel in a drainage pipe. The sequence of events violated every provision of the Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. He was beaten. He was dragged through the streets of his own country. Finally, he was shot. His son, Mutassim, died alongside him. Their transition from absolute rulers to trophies took less than an hour. The victors transported the bodies to Misrata. They did not use a morgue or a hospital. Instead, the remains lay in a commercial meat refrigerator for 4 days. Public viewing was mandatory. Thousands of Libyans queued to photograph the gray skin of their former leader among hanging carcasses. This was a calculated dismantling of the Gaddafi myth. The family's political protection vanished with that final shot. Safia had now lost 3 sons: Saif al-Arab, Khamis, and Mutassim. Multiple grandchildren were dead. Her daughter was a widow. Her remaining sons occupied foreign prison cells or desert hideouts. Burial followed in a secret desert location to prevent the grave from becoming a shrine. Sophia could not even claim the bodies. Powerless and isolated, she turned to the only weapon left to a political ghost. Sophia began writing her first letters to the international community. The widow of a man who ignored international law for 40 years now demanded its protection. In October 2013, Sophia Gaddafi broke her silence. The occasion was the 2nd anniversary of her husband's death. She did not seek a revolution. She sought a grave. Sophia published an open letter addressed to the United Nations, the European Union, and the African Union. The platform was specific. Only the voice of Russia agreed to carry her message. In the text, she transitioned from the wife of a brotherly leader to a desperate petitioner. She demanded the remains of Muammar and their son, Mutassim. How could a regime built on iron fall to this? The contrast was absolute. Sophia described the final hours in Sirte based on witness accounts and media footage. Rebels captured them alive. They endured beatings. They were paraded through the streets. Finally, they were killed. The cruelty did not end with death. For 4 days, the bodies lay in a commercial meat locker in Misrata. It was a public spectacle. Thousands queued to take photographs with the corpses. This violated every tenet of Islamic tradition, which dictates immediate and dignified burial. To Sophia, they were martyrs. To the world, they were trophies in a refrigerator. She demanded more than just bones. Sophia pressed the African Union for answers regarding her other sons, Khamis and Saif al-Arab. She requested an investigation into their deaths and the location of their graves. She specifically pleaded for contact with Saif al-Islam, then held in isolation in the mountain city of Zintan. Sophia reminded the African Union of the billions her husband had provided them over decades. She expected loyalty. She received nothing. The international community, the organizations she petitioned, and the allies Gaddafi once bought remained silent. The letter triggered no investigations. It moved no borders. The Gaddafi family was politically erased and physically scattered across the desert. In 2025, Aisha Gaddafi lives as a phantom in Oman. The glamorous Claudia Schiffer of North Africa is now a political relic, isolated by a decade of exile. It is a stark collapse from the absolute privilege of 2006. The trajectory began with a birthright of total power. Born on December 25, 1976, Aisha was Muammar Gaddafi's only biological daughter. The colonel did not just raise her, he weaponized her image. She became the regime's premier instrument of soft power. While her mother, Sophia, remained a shadow, Aisha courted the global stage. She moved between worlds with calculated ease. One year, she was a law student at the Sorbonne in Paris. The next, she wore a military uniform, holding the rank of lieutenant colonel. The regime's legitimacy was reinforced through her international standing. In 2009, the UN appointed her a Goodwill Ambassador. It was a formal validation of the Gaddafi name. This was the peak of her diplomatic capital, a bridge between a revolutionary Jamahiriya and the Western elite. Her personal life mirrored this state-level excess. In 2006, she married her cousin, Colonel Ahmed al-Gaddafi al-Qasi. The wedding in Tripoli was a $1 million display of dynastic strength. International dignitaries watched as Aisha emerged from the ceremony, not just as a bride, but as one of the most powerful figures in the state. She soon converted this status into a weapon of geopolitical defiance. She joined the defense team for Saddam Hussein during his trial in Iraq. It was an aggressive exit from the world of gala dinners and onto the front lines of international law. The transition from a high society wedding to the front lines of global confrontation was swift. Aisha Gaddafi traded the gala circuit for a role as a geopolitical provocateur. Why would the daughter of a head of state defend a fallen dictator? For Aisha, it was a defense of the principle of sovereignty against Western interference. In 2003, she traveled to Baghdad shortly before the American invasion. She met with Saddam Hussein personally. When his trial began, she officially joined his legal defense team. She argued that Western powers possessed no legal or moral authority to judge an Arab leader. To Washington, she was a pariah. To many in the Arab street, she was a symbol of defiance. Her activism extended beyond the Middle East. Aisha utilized the very democratic mechanism she criticized. She appeared at Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. There, she publicly declared support for the Irish Republican Army. It was a calculated strike at the British establishment. She positioned herself as a champion of liberation movements while holding the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Libyan army. She was young, educated, and fluent in the language of international law. She turned Western freedoms into a weapon against the West itself. The public image of a principled revolutionary masked a more rigid reality. Aisha remained the most loyal instrument of her father's will. She defended his administration even as the internal pressure reached a breaking point. When the first protests erupted in Benghazi in February 2011, she did not call for reform. The United Nations and the European Union blacklisted Aisha Gaddafi in February 2011. This was the moment of no return. Her diplomatic immunity vanished. Global authorities froze her international bank accounts and restricted her movement. They no longer saw a mediator or a lawyer. They saw a willing accomplice to a collapsing regime. Ideological clashes of the previous decade had finally transformed into a kinetic war. Aisha chose her side with calculated aggression. In February 2011, she appeared on state television. She did not call for calm. She labeled the protesters traitors and agents of foreign intelligence. For the daughter of the revolution, the uprising was not a domestic crisis. It was a violation of Libyan sovereignty. In April 2011, she stood on the balcony of the Bab al-Azizia compound in Tripoli. The setting was symbolic. It was the 25th anniversary of the 1986 American airstrikes. Aisha wore a green headscarf. She spoke to a crowd of loyalists while NATO jets circled above. She compared the Western intervention to the brutal Italian colonization of the early 20th century. She promised the world that Libyans would never surrender. This rhetoric shifted her status from a civilian relative to a high-value target. NATO intelligence added her name to the list of regime figures marked for neutralization. The transition was absolute. Her transition from a global fashion icon to a legitimate military objective was complete. The bombs began to fall on the family residences. Sanctions were merely ink on paper. By the spring of 2011, the bombs became the new reality. The luxury of the Tripoli villas offered no protection against laser-guided munitions. In April 2011, a NATO airstrike hit the residence of Saif al-Arab Gaddafi. The explosion leveled the structure in seconds. Dust settled over the ruins of a family home. Aisha's brother died instantly. Her first child was killed in the same blast. At the time, Aisha was pregnant with her fourth child. She had to identify the bodies while the coalition jets still circled above. How long does a NATO deployment cycle last? Usually 90 days. For Aisha, 3 months was the time it took to dismantle her entire world. In July 2011, a second strike hit the family compound. The shockwave shattered the remaining windows. Her husband, Ahmed, died in the wreckage. Another of her children was killed. Aisha survived again, shielded by the same walls that became her family's tomb. Tripoli fell to the rebel forces on August 24th. The streets belonged to the opposition. Aisha was 9 months pregnant. She carried her one surviving child toward the border, while the symbols of the Jamahiriya were torn from the walls. 4 immediate family members were dead. 3 months of warfare had erased her past. She turned her back on the burning capital and crossed the frontier, a golden mermaid with the face of Aisha Gaddafi. Egyptian artisans carved it from solid wood and covered it in gold leaf. Rebels found the sofa on August 22nd. They did not see a piece of furniture. They saw a monument to excess. The house in Tripoli fell, and the symbols of the regime became trophies for the street. While the rebels photographed the golden scales of the mermaid, the real Aisha was in the desert. The escape was a convoy of dust. On August 29th, she crossed the border into Algeria. Her mother and brothers were with her. They were no longer diplomats. They were fugitives. The destination was Janet. It is a transit point for smugglers on the edge of the Sahara. On August 30th, the transition from palace to exile became physical. Aisha went into labor. She gave birth to a daughter in a border town known only to nomads. She named the child Sophia Janet. It was her 4th child, but only the 2nd to survive the year. The girl was born into a world where her family name was a death sentence. Exile did not bring silence. Aisha moved from the desert to a state villa, but her rhetoric remained at war. She appeared on television. She called the new Libyan authorities traitors. She labeled them agents of the West. Aisha looked back a century to find a parallel. She compared the North Atlantic Treaty Organization strikes to the 1911 Italian colonization. She reminded the world that her great-grandfather died in an air raid that year. She praised the Irish Republican Army. She supported the Iraqi insurgency. She used her asylum as a megaphone. The Algerian government expected gratitude. They received a diplomatic crisis. Aisha Gaddafi violated the primary condition of her humanitarian stay. Political asylum in Algeria provided a roof, but it could not breach the financial blockade. The family found themselves in a state of terminal economic paralysis. The mechanism of the freeze was absolute. In 2011, the United Nations passed Resolution 1970. This document transformed billions of dollars into digital ghosts. The Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates followed suit in 2012. They locked every account linked to the Gaddafi name. What is the price of security? The answer is 18 billion frozen pounds. This sum exceeds the annual gross domestic product of several African nations. On paper, Safia was among the wealthiest widows on earth. In reality, she possessed nothing. A screen shows a United Nations ledger. A cursor hovers over a list of offshore accounts. A red "denied" stamp slams across a transfer request. The sanctions targeted officials accused of violence against civilians. There were no exceptions for humanitarian needs or religious burials. The wealth existed only as a line of code in a foreign database. The family lived in a golden cage where the bars were made of seized assets. Isolation bred desperation. Aisha Gaddafi realized that silence was no longer a currency she could trade. She broke the conditions of her stay and began making public speeches. Aisha Gaddafi's defiance transformed the family from high-profile guests into a geopolitical liability. Financial paralysis and a sense of entrapment turned the sanctuary into a cage. Rage followed. Aisha broke her silence, appearing on Syrian television to denounce the new Libyan government as traitors. She called for a nationwide revolt. She publicly praised the Irish Republican Army. This was no longer private grief. It was an attack on the regional order. The Algerian government faced a diplomatic crisis. President Abdelaziz Bouteflika demanded absolute silence. Aisha responded with fire. She reportedly set her safe house ablaze multiple times, blaming her hosts for the family's mounting restrictions. The final provocation occurred within the residence walls. Aisha allegedly burned a portrait of President Bouteflika. Algiers moved immediately to liquidate the toxic asset. In October 2012, the authorities expelled the family. Safia, Aisha, and Mohammed were quietly transitioned to Oman. The Gulf nation offered asylum under a single, non-negotiable term: total political sterilization. Safia Farkash vanished into the silence of Muscat. Her name only surfaced in technical UN reports tracking sanctioned individuals. In 2016, the new Libyan government attempted a gesture of reconciliation. They announced Safia could return home. She traveled to the border. Entry was denied. Security forces turned her back toward the desert. The legal grip loosened only a decade later. In January 2024, the UN Security Council officially lifted the travel ban on Safia Farkash. The council no longer classified the widow as a threat to international peace. Her travel documents were restored, but her bank accounts remained under a global freeze. As of 2025, Safia Farkash is believed to split her time between Oman and Cairo. In Oman, Aisha exchanged the incendiary gestures of her Algerian exile for the cold precision of legal warfare. The fire shifted from the walls of her safe house to the desks of international tribunals. She replaced outbursts with affidavits. The strategy was simple: weaponize the very Western institutions that had dismantled her father's reign. Aisha hired teams of lawyers to petition the International Criminal Court. She demanded a formal investigation into the death of Muammar Gaddafi and the legality of NATO's airstrikes. She insisted on a fair trial for her brother, Saif al-Islam, who remained a captive of Libyan militias. Did these legal maneuvers restore her family's name? The courts dismissed her petitions one by one. The European Union had blacklisted Aisha in February 2011. The sanctions were total, an asset freeze and a complete travel ban. For years, her legal team chipped away at the Brussels bureaucracy. In 2017, the EU General Court finally issued a ruling. The judges acknowledged she no longer posed a threat to international security. The victory was a mathematical insult. The court lifted the travel ban, but the asset freeze remained in place. Aisha possessed a valid passport, but zero access to her wealth. She had the legal right to cross borders and no capital to fund the journey. Following the ruling, her trail went cold across the Middle East. Reports placed her in Amman, then back in Muscat, then Cairo. The legal win resulted in a phantom freedom. She disappeared from the public record. Legal victories failed to restore her past. Beyond the courtroom, only the canvas remained. Aisha Gaddafi traded the political podium for the silent studio of Muscat. In October 2024, her transition reached a symbolic peak. The State Museum of Oriental Art in Russia opened an exhibition of her work. Experts noted the shift. There were no slogans, no green flags, no revolutionary iconography. What does a neutralized life look like? It looks like abstract strokes and muted landscapes. Every painting underwent scrutiny. Omani authorities required total political sterilization. She complied. The North African Claudia Schiffer now exists as a series of frames in a gallery. Her children grow up in a linguistic vacuum. They attend international schools in Muscat, separated from the Arabic streets of Tripoli. They speak the languages of their tutors, not their ancestors. The wealth of the Jamahiriya is a fairy tale they never heard. They carry the name Gaddafi as a genetic burden. It is a brand of infamy for a grandfather they never met. It is a shadow of a father killed before they could remember his face. For Aisha, Oman is a gilded purgatory. Technically, she is a free woman. She moves through the city without guards. She raises her family in safety. But the border is a wall. Returning to Libya means immediate arrest or death. She remains an eternal exile in a country that permits her existence only as an artist. The woman who once commanded the world's attention now exists as a ghost in the desert. In Oman, the luxury is real, but the power is gone. She is 48 years old, a lieutenant colonel without an army, a UN ambassador without a mission. The digital world, however, refused to let her name rest. In 2021, thousands of inboxes filled with a strange request. The emails claimed to be from Aisha Gaddafi. The text promised a share of $27 million. It was a classic scam. "I have millions frozen," the digital phantom wrote. "I need your help to move the capital." The irony was surgical. The sum nearly matched the value of her seized real estate. Yet the real Aisha was living on the state charity of a foreign sultan. The contrast between the myth and the reality is absolute. While scammers used her face to sell dreams of hidden gold, the actual woman spent her days in a studio. She paints. She watches her teenage children grow up in a country that is not theirs. In 2023, the UN finally lifted her travel ban. She can now fly anywhere in the world, but her bank accounts remains frozen. She has not touched Libyan soil since August 2011. She survived the purge that claimed her father, 3 of her brothers, and her husband in a single 6-month span. She is the keeper of the family's silence. Her brothers, however, met a different end. While the women fled toward a life of shadows, the men of the clan stayed to face the kinetic reality of the revolution. One by one, the pillars of the military regime collapsed under NATO steel. While the survivors secured a path to exile, the military backbone of the Jamahiriya disintegrated in the desert. Qamis al-Gaddafi was not merely a son, he was the commander of the 32nd Brigade. This was the regime's Praetorian Guard. The unit held the only qualitative advantage in the Libyan arsenal. They operated modern Russian T-72 tanks. They possessed tactical discipline. While other divisions fractured, the 32nd remained a cohesive killing machine. Qamis moved between front lines with a singular objective: total suppression. The International Criminal Court tracked his movements. By August, The Hague prepared an arrest warrant for crimes against humanity. But kinetic force moved faster than international law. August 29, 2011. A convoy of armored SUVs speeds toward Tarhuna. The dust from the desert road masks their heat signatures, but not from NATO surveillance. High-altitude sensors lock onto the lead vehicle. Static crackles through the brigade's radio frequency. Distorted commands break under the roar of approaching jet engines. An air-to-ground missile strikes the center of the column. The lead Toyota vanishes in a sphere of white heat and jagged steel. Secondary explosions from ammunition crates rip through the following vehicles. Black smoke towers over the scorched asphalt. The commander was 28 years old. Loyalists claim he escaped the fire. Intelligence reports state otherwise. Organized resistance died in that intersection. No formal identification followed the strike. 3 months after commies perished in the sands, the regime's primary political asset fell into a trap. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi represented the dynasty's last hope for survival. He was the London-educated reformer, the bridge to the West, the man destined to modernize the Libyan state. The transformation was clinical and rapid. One speech erased a decade of diplomacy. Saif appeared on television as the Arab Spring ignited. He did not call for dialogue. He promised rivers of blood. He vowed to fight until the last bullet. The International Criminal Court reacted with unprecedented speed. The Hague issued an arrest warrant just 90 days after the first protests began. Expectation: a PhD from the London School of Economics leading a democratic transition. Reality: a suspected war kingpin threatening a televised massacre. Capture came in November 2011. Militia fighters intercepted Saif near the small town of Zintan. He was attempting to cross the border into Niger. In 2015, a court in Tripoli sentenced him to death in absentia for crimes against humanity. The legal net was tight. The Western world had officially codified the impossibility of a Gaddafi return. The Zintan militia ignored the sentence. They ignored The Hague. The fighters refused to hand their prisoner to the central government or international observers. Saadi al-Gaddafi was the diplomatic currency of the desert. While Saif al-Islam remained a high-value captive in Zintan, his brother Saadi became a commodity for international trade in Niger. Why would the new Libyan authorities pursue a failed footballer? The answer was simple. A public trial mattered more than actual justice. Before the war, Saadi's ambitions were a punchline for European sports journalists. He wanted to be a professional athlete. He bought his way into Italian football. He invested millions into Juventus and Perugia. The result was 30 minutes of professional playtime across his entire career and a doping scandal in 2007. When the Tripoli front collapsed, the athlete fled. He crossed the southern border into Niger. By 2014, his sanctuary became a marketplace. The Nigerian government finalized the deal. Niamey received a package of economic aid and border security guarantees. In exchange, they handed over the third son. The extradition followed a cold, visual protocol. A private jet landed at Tripoli airport. Guards forced Saadi into a blue prison uniform. They held him down. Electric clippers hummed. One by one, clumps of black hair fell to the concrete floor as guards shaved his head for the cameras. Camera flashes blinded the prisoner during the intake process at Al-Hadba prison. He faced charges for the murder of coach Bashir al-Riyani and crimes committed during the uprising. Justice, however, proved as inconsistent as his football career. In 2018, a court acquitted him of the murder. He remained behind bars for 3 more years. He walked free in 2021. A private plane immediately carried him from Libya to Turkey. Today, the 51-year-old lives in Istanbul. He posts occasionally on social media about national elections and stability. He has no political influence and no permanent home in the country his father once owned. He remains in Turkey under a policy of quiet exile. Hannibal Gaddafi did not just avoid his father's politics. He actively dismantled Libya's international relations years before the first shots of the revolution. In July 2008, the 5-star Hotel President Wilson in Geneva became a geopolitical battleground. Swiss police entered the luxury suite. They arrested Hannibal and his wife, Aline Scaff. The charge? Systematic assault of 2 domestic employees. How did a hotel brawl spark a national crisis? Muammar Gaddafi responded with diplomatic terrorism. He viewed his son's arrest as an insult to the state. The retaliation was immediate and disproportionate. Tripoli suspended oil deliveries to Switzerland. Libyan authorities withdrew $5 billion from Swiss bank accounts. 2 Swiss businessmen, Max Goldie and Rashid Hamdani, were seized in Tripoli and held as hostages for nearly 2 years. Back in 2008, this arrogance signaled the regime's terminal rot. Hannibal's record was already a map of violence across Europe. Rome, 2001, an attack on Italian police. Paris, 2004, drunk driving at over 100 kilometers per hour. Paris, 2005, the assault of his pregnant girlfriend. Each time, diplomatic immunity acted as a shield. In Switzerland, that shield cracked, forcing the Kremlin of the desert to burn its bridges with the West to protect a serial offender. When the uprising began in 2011, the bridges remained scorched. Hannibal found no sanctuary in Europe. He joined the convoy heading west across the border into Algeria. Past sins of the regime caught up with Hannibal Gaddafi in 2015, when he attempted to enter Lebanon. He was not looking for a revolution, he was looking for his wife. Syrian agents lured him toward the border. They kidnapped him. They stuffed the son of a dictator into a car trunk. They drove him across the frontier and handed him over to the Lebanese police. The charge reached back to 1978. Musa al-Sadur, a revered Shia imam, vanished during an official visit to Tripoli. Hannibal was 2 years old at the time of the disappearance. He had no role in the decision. He had no knowledge of the grave. Yet, in the eyes of the Lebanese judicial system, he was a living archive. He became a high-value hostage to a 37-year-old mystery. 10 years. That is how long Hannibal remained in a basement cell in Beirut without a trial. The room had no windows. No natural light reached the stone walls. Human rights organizations labeled the detention a political kidnapping. The Lebanese state demanded information he did not possess. In January 25, the stalemate broke. A court set bail at $11 million. Hannibal Gaddafi paid the sum and walked out of the prison, but he remains under a strict travel ban. The year 2021 marked a shift. While his brothers remained in foreign cells or graves, Saif al-Islam stepped out of the shadows. He chose the New York Times for his return. The location? Zintan. The age? 52. The message? He was no longer a prisoner. Could a man under a death sentence reclaim a nation? In Libya, chaos makes the impossible routine. Saif announced a bid for the presidency. He spoke of nostalgia for his father's era. He claimed his former jailers were now his loyal bodyguards. The registration of his candidacy shattered the fragile political process. It did not lead to a vote, it led to a collapse. The elections were canceled. Libya remains fractured between 2 rival centers of gravity, Tripoli and Benghazi. Each side relies on foreign bayonets. Saif al-Islam reportedly moves through the southern deserts. He maintains a network of loyalists, yet he cannot grasp real authority. He is the last son with political ambitions, drifting through a vacuum of power. By 2025, the geography of the Gaddafi family resembles a map of political asylum across the Middle East. The collapse is no longer a news cycle, it is a permanent state of exile. 14 years after the fall of Sirte, the clan remains scattered, broken, and strategically neutralized by host nations. In Oman, the silence is absolute. Sofia Farkash, the nurse who became a queen, walks through the empty corridors of a secure villa. She cannot access the billions frozen in foreign accounts. She cannot return to Tripoli. Beside her, the eldest son, Mohammed, has become a ghost. He is so invisible that his existence is a footnote in Libyan intelligence reports. Does a shadow have political weight? In Muscat, the answer is no. Aisha Gaddafi, once the Claudia Schiffer of North Africa, now spends her days painting. In 3 months during 2011, She lost her husband and 2 children. Today, she raises her surviving heirs under the strict supervision of Omani authorities. The condition for her safety is simple: total public silence. The rest of the map is equally fractured. Saadi, the failed footballer and special forces commander, resides in Turkey under an uneasy truce. Hannibal has only recently emerged from a decade of detention in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Saif al-Islam remains a nomad in the southern Libyan desert, plotting a return that the international community refuses to recognize. The cost of the revolution is measured in more than just displacement. The family compound at Bab al-Azizia is a field of rubble. Their properties are seized. Their fortune is a digital ghost. Beyond the living, the toll is final. Mutassim, Saif al-Arab, and Khamis are gone. Including the grandchildren, the list of the dead has reached 10. The ruins of the Bab al-Azizia compound in Tripoli now serve as a skeletal monument to a dissolved dynasty. Where a singular center of power once stood, only fractured geography remains. The family that dictated the fate of millions cannot dictate its own movement. Travel restrictions and political realities have effectively dismantled the bloodline. They have not gathered in the same room once since the regime collapsed. For 14 years, Safia Farkash has lived in a state of enforced distance. The United Nations Sanctions Committee maintains a rigid oversight of the family's mobility. Any movement of listed individuals requires a formal notification 30 days in advance. Every flight and every border crossing is a matter of international law. Consequently, the matriarch cannot physically embrace her surviving sons simultaneously. This is not a choice. It is a legal blockade. Aisha remains under surveillance in Oman. Saadi resides in Turkey. Hannibal is trapped in a Lebanese legal vacuum. When the Libyan authorities released Saadi in 2021, his mother could not fly to meet him. When Hannibal's detention in Beirut entered its 10th year, she could not visit his cell. Even as Saif al-Islam attempts a political resurrection from within Libya, he does so without the physical presence of his kin. The sanctions regime has transformed family ties into a series of monitored digital signals. This isolation prevents them from attending weddings, visiting the sick, or even organizing a funeral. The final collapse of the dynasty occurred in an unmarked pit in the Libyan desert. This is where the body of Muammar Gaddafi lies. There is no headstone. There is no map. How does a state erase a 42-year history? By denying it a location. The new Libyan authorities buried the former leader alongside his son Mutassim in an undisclosed desert sector. The strategy was purely geopolitical. A grave is a site of memory. A secret site is a void. By hiding the remains, the transitional government prevented the creation of a shrine for loyalists. They chose to fight the ghost of the regime with the silence of the shifting sands. 0 graves, 0 monuments, 0 places to gather. This total erasure of the patriarch mirrored the fate of the women who shared his name. Fatiha, the first wife, chose the safety of obscurity. She disappeared from the political record decades before the fall. Safia, the second wife, remained at the epicenter. She lost her status, her sons, and the right to bury her husband. The International Criminal Court and the United Nations Sanctions Committee maintained the blockade. Safia's formal request to recover the bodies of Muammar and Mutassim were systematically ignored. The family remains a collection of monitored signals across borders. They cannot break bread or mourn together. The desert has finished what the revolution started. The Libyan state functions on the absolute absence of its former creators. The regime essentially devoured its own.